Okay, welcome back to PACE, Indigenous Nonviolence. And today we're talking about the rights of the Maori. Okay, so the Maori are a group that I am very familiar with. My master's thesis was actually on Maori land loss and reclamation. So I've been to New Zealand three times, continuing on that research. And it's a very interesting case study in nonviolent resistance. So the basis of all Maori land, or rights, especially land rights, is the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi created the country of New Zealand. So it is a treaty between multiple chiefs of the Maori tribes, about 80 of them, and the Crown of England. So the treaty is actually between Maori and the British monarchy, not the country of New Zealand, because that didn't exist until the treaty was created. So if you look at a certain part of the text, it says, Her Majesty the Queen confirms and guarantees to the tribes of New Zealand the full and exclusive and undisturbed possessions of their lands, estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties which they may collectively or individually possess and desire to retain in their possession. So the interesting thing about this passage here about other properties which they may possess is that it was later used to apply to things that were not considered resources at that time. So for example, radio waves. The Maori have Maori television, Maori radio, because they've said these are resources that we own, even though we didn't recognize them in 1840 at the time of the Treaty of Waitangi. Another example is submerged lands. So a big issue in New Zealand between Maori and the government was the what they call the foreshore, so the land between high tide and low tide. The Maori said that belonged to them, and there's quite a bit of economic resources if you think about the whole coast of New Zealand and that land. Even things like the bottom of a lake, they have argued successfully that they own that, and so Maori have been successful at extending the meaning of this notion of possession and property. The signing ceremony happened in this, what they call a marae. Here's a photo, a painting of that moment, and the Maori considered themselves to have formed something like a sovereign entity with this flag. All those rights were sort of forgotten for about a century and a half actually, until about 1990. And at that time, the Maori came back kind of in a renaissance as an ethnic group within New Zealand with a new flag, sort of a cultural flag, which is this lower flag here. But I've been to this treaty house. It's in the north. It's a very quiet area now. And here's a picture of that. So some tribes opposed the treaty, but it was very much a minority. One of them actually cut down this flagpole here. The purpose of the treaty was actually not to give up sovereignty. It was actually to get policing in a town which was called the hellhole of the Pacific. It was called Russell. And if you can see that this is a channel, on the other side of this bay was the town of Russell. And Russell was a very, very rowdy area. It was a kind of a sailor town, port town, and the Maori could not handle the British sailors who were coming in, prostitution, crimes, alcohol, all of those kinds of things. It was too much for them, and so they actually wanted the British to just police their own people. So the point I skipped on the first part, what the Maori version of the treaty says is that they are ceding what they call kawanatanga, which is just a word meaning governance, whereas their term for sovereignty was rangatiratanga. So a chief in a tribe is called a rangatira, a sovereign in a sense. And nowhere in the treaty does it say in the Maori version that they're ceding rangatiratanga. They're ceding kawanatanga, governance only. But in the English version it says ceding sovereignty in exchange for undisturbed possession of their resources. So that is an issue that is fundamental to this treaty and plagues the debates today. In response to about 2 decades of protest of Maori saying honor the treaty, the New Zealand government created the Waitangi Tribunal. This was actually the topic of my research in my master's thesis. And the tribunal is a very interesting entity which is a court, and it hears claims from both sides, developers often, and then tribes on the other side. And then both sides go and do research that goes extremely deep into both sides' real understanding of what was the transaction that occurred, often in the 1800s, in, say, the sale of land that led to that land being developed, whereas now the tribes say they actually still own that land. This is something far beyond anything that's been done in Hawaii. The depth of these reports is really quite astounding, and it gets into oral history, cultural meanings, and all these kinds of things, and they often have a third neutral report, and so when they make a decision, they're fully armed with all the facts and all the perspectives. And often Maori have been awarded settlements for their claims, and there's started to develop a consensus about what the size of those awards should be. And so the consensus is right now saying basically $170 million for a large tribe and about $80 million for a small tribe. And that was based on the early settlements for some of the tribes. And when I say a large tribe, for example, one of the first tribes to get 170 million was a tribe that numbered somewhere between 40 and 50,000 members. So 170 million seems like a lot, but it's covering a lot of people, where a small tribe might be 20,000 people, and they would get 80 million. Now, at one point, they tried to cap all the claims, saying with all the claims combined, we're only going to limit the amount that we're going to shell out to 1 billion. And the Maori had a giant meeting and a land march, and they rejected that cap, which they called the fiscal envelope. So now there's no cap on Maori claims. Still a lot of debate about the numbers. What is a real valid number? Taking into account what's reasonable for the Crown and what is reasonable for the suffering that Maori have endured. There was a movement in the 1800s called the Kingitanga Movement, and you can see the word king in there because that's what it was doing, was creating a king. One of the problems the Maori had was that they are divided into so many tribes. There are maybe as many as 120 Maori tribes. And so you have 120 rangatiras, or chiefs. So they wanted to consolidate that into one. And so the majority of the tribes did create a consensus that the king would come out of a tribe called Tainui. And because they still had prophets at the time, and one of the prophets said, look to Tainui. And what the Kingitanga Movement was trying to do was prevent what they called the piecemeal alienation of land. So, meaning that individual Maori would sell off individual tracts of land, small tracts, to the point where all the land is now sold. So what they were trying to do was create one owner who would own all the land, and that would prevent this kind of small sales that end up alienating all the land. So the Kingitanga movement still did succeed in creating a king who the majority, but not all of Maori recognize, and that still exists today. And I think they're in their 5th or 6th in the line of these kings. Now, the last one was actually a queen, and it's a king at this point. But they are hereditary from Tainui tribe. Some of the resources Maoris have been able to retain and get control of include, as I said, radio waves. They have a television station, the foreshore, I mentioned those. Things that are not considered resources at the time of the treaty. Maori at this point, when you compare it to Hawaiians, it's interesting because it's a lot of land in absolute terms, 4 million acres. That's actually how much land there is in Hawaii. But that's out of a total of 60 million acres in New Zealand. One of the things I did was look at the comparison of the two, Maori and Hawaiians. Hawaiians have control over a larger percentage, although a smaller number, but that control is much, much less in terms of it's held in trust, whereas Maori have pretty direct control over the land that they do control, and that land is it's a lot. Again, it's a lot in absolute terms, not as much in relative terms. So here's the sign of the Maori television station. Maori have used their resources to build kind of capacity at the community level. So one of their major programs is called Kohanga Reo. It sounds a little bit like the Hawaiian program called Punana Leo, because Punana Leo, meaning the language nest, is the Hawaiian language preschools. They were modeled on Kohanga Reo. And it occurred to me, I did a comparison in a sense of these two programs, the immersion in Hawaii and then the Maori immersion. And Hawaiians have something like 12 to 1,500 children in immersion right now, whereas the Maori have 800 schools, 800 immersion schools, so they're orders of magnitude beyond the Hawaiians, although their schools tend to be small, but there's so many more of them. Whereas Hawaiians have a kind of an educational network that they've developed pretty much modeled on what the Maori are doing, like immersion schools, the charter schools, even a Hawaiian college called Halau Wanana is modeled on a program of Maori universities called Wananga. So you can see that Hawaiians are very much following in the footsteps of Maori. As far as nonviolent tactics, they've had a couple of land marches. The second time I was in New Zealand, this was in 2004, they were having a march across the entire North Island. So they marched basically from Waitangi in the very north to Wellington in the very bottom of the North Island, which is the capital. And people would join and leave the march. That's just to give you an idea. It takes about 9 to 12 hours to go across the North Island by train, so it's quite a long distance. And I believe they were successful in getting claims to the foreshore. They have used their settlements to create schools. This is the Tainui Tribal College, and it is college in New Zealand often means high school, but this is a university, and they focus on pretty practical skills, skills that are very much marketable in the region. So this tribe is in the very center of the North Island. Um, it's a pretty rich agricultural area, and there's a lot of potential there. There has been some mismanagement of funds, but they've had some successes as well. So when I look at comparatively, and we're supposed to be looking comparatively with all these cases, you have something happening in the early 70s, and this is not civil rights, this is kind of the post-civil rights period. That is things like Black Power, the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement. All these movements were much more militant than civil rights. So they actually weren't necessarily non-violent in every way. The Maori and the Hawaiian versions of these have been non-violent, but the origin of it was more of this militant idea. And so you see Maori land struggles. This was in 1970. The Maori tried to get back control over a major bluff right in Auckland, in the capital. In the biggest city of Auckland. And it was unsuccessful, but got a lot of media attention for their movement. And Hawaiians were doing a similar thing at a similar time with Kalama Valley right in 1970 as well. In Hawaii and New Zealand, they had groups called the Polynesian Panthers, which dressed in the black jackets and the berets and everything. And so these movements in New Zealand and Hawaii were part of, or inspired by, a more global movement. So that's something you can think about and look at in writing your responses this week, is how are movements inspiring each other, whether it's New Zealand or Hawaii or other Pacific Islanders, which we're going to start looking at next week. Okay? So just as a last kind of parting thought, one of the conclusions I came to in my research on the Maori is looking at this question of why are they significantly more successful in their claims than Hawaiians. And it occurred to me that it is actually the tribal structure. Now that seems a little bit counterintuitive, because you might think tribes divide Maori, and in a way they do. But what they also do is they organize Maori down to the grassroots level. In fact, to be Maori means to be a member of one of those tribes. So that means there's this group that you are a registered member of, and so everybody has a voice in what becomes a larger decision-making process at the higher level. Hawaiians don't have anything like that. Hawaiians, who are considered a racial group right now, there's no way for them to be organized down to the grassroots level. So we just have people in the community who are Hawaiian or say they're Hawaiian, and we sometimes don't know if they're really Hawaiian. And they make statements, and they have often very divergent views and goals, and they're not organized. So that's my view of one of the reasons why Maori are more successful. Is this thing that seems to divide them actually organizes them. So I've proposed that Hawaiians could use family associations to achieve the same effect as tribes, because what tribes really are very large, very, very extended family units. So they're really everybody descended from a common ancestor who settled in New Zealand in the very, very early times, about 1300 AD. So everybody descended from that person is the tribe. And so Hawaiians, if you could, we already have Hawaiian family associations, which are have hundreds of members. If we could sort of politicize those, they could function like tribes. That's my take on this. But look forward to your comments and your responses on the Maori chapter. So Margaret Mutu, who wrote our chapter, is one of the very, very top scholars in the Maori community and very well regarded. So I hope you have some interesting insights that come out of that. And I'll see you guys next time.